Well, hello everyone, wherever you are around the world today. My name is Cameron Jones, Director of Assurance for ASI and the host for today's webinar, which continues our 45 minutes on series, with the topic of today's session being Species Threat Abatement and Restoration Metric, better known as STAR. It gives me great pleasure today in welcoming Ben Jobson to present. Ben is Programme Officer with IBAT, who has been closely involved in the development and the release of STAR. STAR is a new metric available through IBAT. For those of you who aren't aware of the acronym, IBAT is the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. And STAR helps and allows organisations to identify areas where actions to abate threats or restore habitat can help reduce species extinction risk and contribute to overall conservation targets. STAR also supports the establishment of science-based targets for species biodiversity, as well as corporate commitments to nature-positive actions. Nature positive is actually one of the 4 pillars of ASI's 2030 strategy, and also as facilitator personally of the ASI Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Working Group. It's actually of interest to me personally as well too, so I'm looking forward to Ben's presentation today. If you wish to ask Ben a question, please use the Q&A window in your Zoom platform, and Ben and I will aim to answer these questions as best we can at the end of Ben's presentation during the dedicated Q&A session. We've also received a couple of questions during the registration as well, and we'll address those at that time too. So I'll put those questions that you've previously asked to Ben during the Q&A session. So thank you again for your attendance and your participation today. And I'm going to pass over to Ben. So thanks, Ben.
Well, thank you so much, Cameron, for having me to speak today. I'm actually calling in from Brussels at the European Business and Nature Summit. So a very inspiring event and a great place to be talking about some of these emerging themes like nature positive. Today, I'll be covering the STAR metric, stands for Species Threat Abatement and Restoration, and discussing how it can be accessed through IBAT, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. My role is Programme Officer in the IBAT Alliance. I support our users in accessing IBAT and deliver training sessions for our subscribers, and I represent the IBAT Alliance organisations. IBAT being a biodiversity data tool, a web-based platform through which organisations can access the World Database on Protected Areas that's managed and curated by our partner, the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, managed by BirdLife International on behalf of the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership, and the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, of course, from the IUCN, which underpins the STAR metric itself. Now, IBAT is the way through which organisations can access these data, and they can download them through our platform and also screen a range of projects as well for biodiversity assessments and reporting purposes. Now, at the moment, we have nearly 14,000 users from across a range of different organisations and sectors, from the extractives and energy industries through to those with more diverse supply chains, and then the financiers of all of those operations as well. Now, the way that in which these data can be downloaded is either at the site level or the global level, and you can also view and interrogate these data through the IBAT data map as well. So for those of you who are not familiar with key biodiversity areas, they are the most important places in the world for biodiversity, identified under a suite of 11 objective criteria, and the most comprehensive subset of those sites are the important bird and biodiversity areas. Relevant to STAR, actually, across this relatively small portion of the terrestrial surface, 47% of the global STAR scores can be achieved. And that's because a lot of these sites are identified due to the presence of globally threatened species and restricted range species, which are 2 very important elements to the STAR metric. You can also access the World Database on Protected Areas. Of course, this is very relevant for the ASI performance standard and the criterion 8. Through IBAT, you can look at the World Heritage Sites and ensure no-go policies around those, but you can also access the rest of the world database, which currently stands at 271,000 sites around the world, updated on a monthly basis, and viewable through designation. So you can see if it's a certain type of site, like Natura 2000 in Europe, UNESCO World Heritage Network, Ramsar Convention sites, and so on. Or you could look at the governance type, so privately managed, federal, indigenous peoples, all sorts of different considerations there. And then the IUCN management categories, which are a very useful way of standardizing protected areas across borders. Now, for those users that might not necessarily have a strong biodiversity background or necessarily a geospatial analysis background, IBAT is designed to be very intuitive and user-friendly. So one of the ways that we ensure that is through very logical reporting. So what you can do is to store different projects within our system, which are only viewable to you and your colleagues, and then to interrogate those sites based on our reporting options. One of them being the ability to conduct a proximity assessment. So the nearest key biodiversity areas, protected areas, and threatened species within different buffer distances that you determine around sites, as well as the presence of critical habitat around those same buffer distances, and freshwater species within river systems, and the ability to determine what is upstream and downstream of project sites. Another very useful report, increasingly relevant for reporting purposes, is our multi-site assessment. Now this to 1,000 locations in one go, and in a matter of seconds or minutes, you can download the results of a proximity assessment for each of those sites. So you'll know the specific protected areas and KBAs around each of your sites, and then some aggregate summaries, as well as the numbers of threatened species, and in particular, for this conversation, star values per project, which can enable organizations to rank their locations based on the opportunity to deliver contributions to species extinction risk reduction. Now, the reason that we're talking about STAR today and that it is particularly relevant for this group is because it is a mechanism through which organizations can determine their opportunities to reduce species extinction risk, which represents a nature positive outcome for a particular site. It is limited to species, and there are other tools that you can think about for other aspects of biodiversity, but in relation to the TNFD beta release, STAR was mentioned as one of their illustrative metrics, and actually the reason why it came around was to enable organizations to think about their contributions towards things like the draft goal A for the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That draft goal was mentioning that companies, and as well as governments and other organizations, should be able to quantify their opportunity to reduce species extinction risk and to reduce that species extinction risk by half. Now, previously, there was no real way to understand how to do that. And actually, a lot of the information in the IUCN Red List was not very easily accessible beyond the range maps themselves. So STAR has taken that wealth of information from the Red List, which is probably the single largest compendium of species data in the world, and in particular, the distributions and the threats for species have been brought to the fore through the STAR metric. And it's not just us, the IBAT Alliance, that have developed this. It's been a very collaborative process involving 54 institutions across at least 29 countries of the world that took place over several years and resulted in the publication of the metric in Nature in spring last year, and the delivery of the STAR metric within IBAT in autumn last year at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. IBAT is the only place where STAR and all of the data sets I mentioned before are available. You may see STAR incorporated into other things, certainly through, for example, governments, and even Encore, which is a very complementary tool has integrated STAR into its biodiversity module, but actually the information behind it and the raw data set itself wouldn't be downloadable. So IBAT is the place to come for licensed access to that. And the opportunity that STAR itself represents is the ability for companies to identify across their sites the relative opportunities to reduce species extinction risk. So firstly, to realize where you're exposed to highly threatened species that are localized to your operations, and then to think how you can manage those operations to address the threats that a large proportion of those species are facing, and how to actually put a number to that and to report those sorts of contributions. Now I'll move on to talk about STAR itself and what it's comprised of. It is really focusing on two types of activities. The first being the opportunity to abate threats or reduce threats to species that are still at play where they live. And the second half is the restoration element, which represents the opportunities to restore habitat within places where the threats have already been abated. And those two actions can be done in tandem, and actually the scores that you can attain for threat abatement and restoration can be added up. So the additive and scalable nature of the metric is very useful because organizations can compare between their project sites and their supply chains, identify STAR scores across those locations, add them up, which would represent the opportunity across your areas of influence to actually have nature positive contributions. You can prioritize where those contributions might be most significant. And if you have a certain amount of budget or projects to apply, you can apply that where it will be most globally beneficial for species threat reduction. And it's a very useful metric for setting science-based targets and reporting on those as well, all of which I will get to in the next few slides. So the reason why STAR is particularly useful at this time is because governments, civil society, and businesses can start to use the same language and compare what actions they are taking towards targets for nature. So say you have a national target, an organization operating in that country as a commercial entity can also contribute to that agenda and quantify what their contributions would be through the STAR metric. And with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be decided or finalized in December this year, STAR will hopefully be a metric that can be reported in relation to that. And I imagine a lot of you are wondering how the scores are calculated. There are a range of metrics out there today, actually, which give very different scores reflecting different aspects of biodiversity. So the use of a particular metric needs to be chosen based on the question that you're trying to ask and the answer that you're trying to receive. With STAR, it is primarily based around species, threatened species, and the opportunity to reduce those threats and stop them going extinct. And due to that, the way that the metric is calculated is very straightforward and transparent, and all of this is in the methodology of the STAR paper. What it does is it overlays species distribution maps, and these have been modeled. So the graphic I'm showing you on the screen is a simplification, but the range maps are overlaid, and then we account for the size of those ranges, which is very important, and the threat status of the species. So here in this example, we have 3 species with different sized ranges and an area of interest. So that area of interest would be the projects that you upload onto IBAT, and we will overlay that with the ranges and understand in this case that there's an endemic frog species to the area. Its entire population lives within your area of influence. And of course, if you were to implement conservation actions, then you would be able to conserve that species. And if it was poorly managed, it would continue and the risk of extinction would continue. For the hummingbird, maybe half of its range is covered, and for the monkey, maybe 20% of their range is covered. So you can still have significant benefits, but it wouldn't change the fortunes for the whole species. It would only address the threats to a certain part of those species ranges. So the calculation is weighted by the threat category, with critically endangered attaining a higher threat than endangered, vulnerable, and near threatened. And the final calculation, so the final star score for the site, is just the addition of each species specific score. And you'll see the higher scores are coming from species where you have smaller ranges, and a project site represents a relatively large proportion of their range. So the weighting multiplied by the percentage of the population within the area of interest results in a star score, which is aggregated. And then the insights really come from breaking that score down by the threats that these different species are facing. There are 57 different threats that are registered in STAR, and any one of those threats may come out as the most important threat in a STAR report for a particular project. In this example, we have a total STAR score of 50 for 4 species and 6 different threats. And I can see through this matrix table that agriculture is the single largest threat contributing towards this total STAR score. It's a score of 16 points, representing 32% of the total score. And that's the case because 3 of these species are facing threats from agriculture and actually facing them in quite high intensity as well. So if I was looking at this project, I would see that it's got a score of 50, and I can compare that score with other project scores, and I can think, if I want to go ahead and implement STAR-related activities at this project site, what should they focus on? And in this case, it should be agriculture above pollution, for example. If you look at the STAR scores at the global level, there are quite clear trends to where you have higher STAR scores reflected by the darker colors in places where we know there's high biodiversity value. And actually, these places have high overlap of threatened species ranges. Those ranges are quite small. And it contrasts to places where we have the lower STAR scores with the more yellow colors, where we have species with much larger populations. So any project site will only be able to influence a small proportion of those populations. And actually, on average, the species may be less globally threatened. So this is the global raster layer for threat abatement, which is downloadable through IBAT, and you can actually break that down if you're viewing it in GIS by 57 different bands for threat abatement and 57 different bands for restoration. So you can see for energy and mining, where are the highest STAR scores coming from around the world? And actually, it happens to be Madagascar and parts of Colombia. For restoration, you can see slightly different trends. This is focusing on areas that can be restored once threats have been abated. And on average, the scores are slightly lower because we've discounted the restoration scores by 0.3 to account for the fact that it takes a little while to achieve restoration, to make habitat available to species to come back. And it's not 100% successful, guaranteed. Now, it's really important to understand, firstly, what STAR is in relation to the question you're asking, but also what STAR can offer based on the version of STAR that you're looking at. Everything I've shown you today is based on the estimated STAR score, which is a global metric derived from our assessments, which are conducted in Cambridge by the IUCN. And those assessments bring together data from species specialist groups and local sources all around the world, but they do represent global distribution maps that assume that species are evenly distributed across those maps, and that threats are also evenly distributed. So that's an important caveat to bear in mind. And on the ground, the actual situation might be slightly different, which is why the calibration stage of STAR is vital. So this will make the scores that you attain through an estimated STAR report more realistic. It will ground truth the data to verify and validate that there are species and threats that we've predicted or referenced on the ground, and you will be able to set a target based on those calibrated scores that will be more achievable. And the last stage requires simply implementing your conservation actions that you've identified with STAR, and then tracking and reporting your progress towards delivering those targets. The way in which STAR can be accessed through IBAT is firstly through our STAR report, which can screen a given project. It's most useful if you have a spatially explicit area of influence, and you can upload that onto IBAT, either through a GIS file, a shape file, or Google Earth files, KMZs or KMLs. But it can also work for coordinates, and we will provide you with the score for the 5 kilometer grid square, which is the minimum level of granularity that coordinate falls within. And the report will provide you with a total score for your area of interest and a mean score per grid square, which will allow you to compare between projects that might be in different parts of the world, but also different sizes. The report shows you a few maps, which enable you to understand the spatial distribution of STAR scores, but also some tables, which contain the results, the breakdown of those scores by threats. This is an example that I can talk through. It just happens to be in Sumatra, where the major threats are from things like palm oil and rubber and pulp and paper plantations. And the first couple of threats coming out are annual and perennial non-timber crops and logging and wood harvesting. This report would look very different in various other parts of the world. The other ways that STAR can be accessed, as I was mentioning, are through the raster layer that can be downloaded and the multi-site report, which provides you with the total and mean scores per project, which you can use to rank a portfolio in terms of the opportunities from STAR, and then you can conduct these more specific reports based on the locations that you want to prioritize thereafter. Now, STAR has been active for just over a year, given it was launched at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in September last year. And at the moment, we've had around 500 companies subscribe to STAR Beta, which is the first year of STAR, which was an early access period where they could access 30 free STAR reports like this, test them for given locations, and provide us with some feedback and thoughts as to what STAR's strengths and weaknesses are, how fit for purpose it might be, and how we can develop it going forwards in line with business needs. So that's been very useful. And actually the feedback's been quite in line with what we were thinking ourselves and anticipating, which is the need for expansion of biomes, so going beyond terrestrial to thinking about freshwater and marine, and the expansion of taxonomic coverage. So at the moment, birds, mammals, and amphibians, they are included because they are the most comprehensively assessed taxonomic groups. But there are others that we can bring in quite quickly, like reptiles, certain freshwater species groups, things like cycads, conifers. So I'm hoping that this can develop going forwards based on that feedback. And also, we've had some current subscribers of IBAT testing STAR from a range of different sectors, from sourcing various commodities like coffee, and basically doing a STAR analysis of all of their clusters, so they can identify across the world where they might be exposed to more species extinction risk, and where there's opportunity to implement conservation actions that can be globally influential. For metals and mining companies, they are by nature very interested in restoration. So STAR, because it has a restoration layer, is quite useful for them to be able to determine if their current restoration activities are falling within places that can deliver globally significant STAR scores, but also if they're thinking about things like offsets, where those offsets might be located to have maximum benefits. And for oil and gas and energy in general, they're thinking a lot about offshore wind energy, for example. So they're some of the companies that are pushing for marine STAR in particular, but they're also thinking of STAR as an indication of biodiversity significance, which it is. So it's opportunities, but also it enables you to understand where you're encountering really significant biodiversity around the world. So I will stop there, and I'll revert back to Cam if there have been any questions that have come in. I'd love to cover anything that might not have come across really clearly at the start of the presentation, and to thank you very much all again for having me to speak today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. And also thanks to all of you for a few questions that have come through in the session and also prior to the session. I've also got a couple myself personally that I'd like to pose to Ben, but there's a couple that came through, Ben, on the fee structure, the cost of a STAR report, and also user and account details. Do you want to just spend a minute or two explaining to everybody how they can access STAR? Is it exclusively through IBAT? What the costs are? Is there a cost differentiator depending on, you know, not-for-profit SMEs or large multinationals, for example?
Thanks very much. Very useful question. It touches on basically how to access IBAT in general, and our vision and mission, which is really to integrate biodiversity data. So you don't come to IBAT just for one aspect of the data. You can come away with the IUCN Red List data, the World Database on Protected Areas data, World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas data, and the derived data sets like STAR and range rarity. So we're trying to provide a range of data that are all very complementary to each other. They're very useful for assessment and reporting purposes. And you can access them either through subscriptions, which is an annual access period through which you can download the data and a range of different reports, and also have access to the most up-to-date version of the data. So when it comes to protected areas, they're updated every month. With the Red List and KBAs, it's several times a year. And with STAR, it's yet to be determined, but it will likely be slightly less frequent than the core data sets themselves. With pay-as-you-go, which is the other option, you can download individual reports and portions of data ad hoc. So if you have one project that pops up that you want to look at in more detail, you can download a report or a portion of data for that. So subscriptions aim to make it more cost effective. So if you're screening a large number of sites, then those pay-as-you-go fees will be reduced in the subscriptions. But broadly, to give ballpark figures, an individual report would be $750 US, and subscriptions, which contain from tens to hundreds of reports to unlimited, range from $5,000 per year to $20,000. The very top level at the moment also incorporates the global derived data layers, which also reference STAR, and that's $35,000 a year. And all of these license fees are returned to our partner organizations in a non-profit scenario where they enable the organizations to update and maintain the data, which are very cost intensive and labor intensive to maintain for the global public good. So that's the way it's all set up.
Great, thanks, Ben. One question came through with respect to greenfields versus brownfields. A lot of what you've presented today is very much in the greenfields context, but for a brownfields operation, is STAR still applicable, and how does that work for a brownfields operation?
Thanks, good question. STAR is definitely still applicable. I would suppose it depends on the type of site that you're assessing. If you're just looking at, for example, offices or factories within an urban landscape, there's not huge STAR-related benefits that you can deliver on site. And certainly through your supply chains, that's where the biodiversity impacts might be happening and where the STAR scores can be delivered in much greater scale. But when it comes to restoration, there would be areas where you will have high restoration scores, which would be brownfield sites. So I think it depends on the type of activity and the location. STAR will enable you to identify a range of opportunities in any part of the world, but they will be more significant for threat abatement, where the where the biodiversity is currently more intact because there's not necessarily habitat to restore, but there are threats to abate. So STAR draws from all sorts of threats that may be linked to business activities, but may not. But they are all threats that companies can engage with. So if you are doing a STAR analysis and you happen to be in places where the factories and offices are scoring quite low, there would be opportunities in the surrounding landscape, especially at places like key biodiversity areas, where you can engage in partnerships and activities that can deliver STAR scores that are much more significant.
Good, thanks, Ben. I noticed on one of your slides you had a graphic and it had the phrase area of interest. We have what I'm assuming is a comparable phrase in the performance standard, area of influence. Are they one and the same things with respect to STAR? Because a question came through with respect to how to define area of influence in a STAR perspective. So one and the same, area of interest, area of influence?
Thank you. Yeah, good question. And I did use both of those terms because I had read area of influence in the performance standards, but on our slides we have area of interest. And in IBATs, you will see them called projects. They can be considered as the same for the purposes of the generation of a STAR report. And what you would want to do is to upload your area of interest as a polygon, capturing your site, but also the area that you want to manage. So that could go beyond the boundaries of a mine to the rest of the land that is under ownership and influence, and it could go beyond the immediate footprint of a site in a brownfield location. So yes, I would upload the entire area that you want to screen, and that will be returned in the report that you might download.
And in terms of defining that area of interest or area of influence, as I said, we've got our own guidance in the performance standard guidance documents and discuss that. Does STAR have its own bespoke or specific guidance, or typically it is commensurate with what we prescribe with respect to, ancillary facilities, air sheds, watersheds, and so forth?
So the minimum level of granularity is 5 kilometers grid in a grid square. So if you have a site that is smaller than that, and you only incorporate a 1 kilometer buffer, for example, then you'll still receive the score for that entire 5 kilometer grid square. If you're thinking about areas that are larger than that, then you actually can look at STAR at any level from that 5 kilometer grid square up to the world. So if we're thinking about what a STAR score means, it's not a 0 to 10 or a 0 to 100 sort of score, but it is a score of 0 globally if all species are least concern. And the situation we're actually facing is that we have 40,000 threatened species, and the score represents the threats that all birds, mammals, and amphibians are facing. So if you look at a STAR report for any area of interest, that could be the 5 kilometers square, but also we've seen organizations using STAR at the national level. So it really depends on the scale that you're operating at. But I'd say that it could be used in a commensurate way to the recommendations of your performance standard.
Great, thanks, Ben. A question came through, and it also relates a little bit to my question with, the Taskforce for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, that's coming through very, very quickly and on the radar very much. And a question came through that's probably related to that in terms of how will STAR play a part, how will it be mentioned in the global biodiversity framework moving forward? What role will it play? How does IBAT see STAR sitting in that framework?
Thanks very much. Very important questions, and I think this is why STAR came into existence in the first place, certainly in relation to the draft Goal A of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which was to aim to reduce species extinction risk by half. And there was previously no way that organizations could calculate how that might have been achieved through their actions, or at least calculate what their contributions towards those goals might be. In relation to the TNFD, all of those discussions have come around since the initial work was done on STAR, but it has been very appropriate for those types of assessments. So, or it certainly will be. It was mentioned STAR in the last release of the TNFD beta framework as one of the illustrative metrics, and discussing how it can be used to quantify the opportunities to reduce species extinction risk. In terms of how IBAT is thinking about those opportunities, IBAT is not an organization itself, it's more of this alliance. So our partners are involved with the IUCN and the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, operating as knowledge partners on the TNFD, and the IBAT manager sitting on the data catalyst. So we are thinking how STAR and IBAT can be used for TNFD related assessments. I think IBAT comes into play very much in the locate phase and the assessment of risks and opportunities. STAR primarily for the opportunities side of that process. And then there are other tools that are complementary, like Encore for the impacts and dependencies side of thing.
Thanks, Ben. And related to this, a comment came through about, I guess, a concern that a participant had with respect to, over-promising or being worried that STAR is saying something but may not be able to deliver on that promise. And that was more of a comment than a question, I guess. But I wanted to leverage off that by also saying, or asking a question of you, Ben. I'm assuming STAR are going to be taking more data sets, more data fields over time and building upon this and coming up with newer versions and more accurate data and building a greater level of accuracy and reliability to the tool. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. Very interesting discussions. It'd be great to have that conversation with the audience members. I'd say STAR is quite transparent and honest about what it does provide. It is limited, as all global data sets and analyses are, to particular caveats, that some of which we will be able to overcome with the expansion of biomes and taxa, but others that potentially won't be. So there will always be a need for the calibration of our estimated scores, which actually are a score on paper, which can then be ground truthed through site level information. In terms of how that will be done, there is guidance that has been written. It's very detailed, and it's been written by the whole of the STAR working group on just how that calibration process should work. So what data needs to be collected, how sites need to be considered in relation to, for example, background change, counterfactuals, control sites. And I think once that guidance is out there, people will understand how STAR can be applied more specifically from what at the moment is a very useful estimation to the next stages, which will be actually calibrating and target setting. But I'd say compared to other metrics out there, it provides a lot more direction and ability to standardize across sites and to understand the composition of what the actual score is representing at a site. So I think in some respects, it has moved the metrics landscape forwards in a positive way. We don't want to be adding to the increasing range of tools out there, but we think that this is a very useful development from the red list, which was previously less accessible by way of the type of information you could derive from it.
Great. Two more questions, Ben, before we wrap up. We're nearly out of time. A quick one. It's back. We're stepping back a little bit with respect to accessibility, fees, and so forth. There's been a couple of questions asked about is there an option, try before you buy, so to speak, a free of charge version or an introductory offer or something along those lines where ASI members could potentially just trial it and see how they go. Is that option available?
Thank you. Great suggestion. And for those that are on the call, we'd love to, and others that might catch up later, we'd love to do some one-to-one sessions with organizations where we can demonstrate this in more detail than we might have been able to today, and discuss how we can apply IBAT and STAR to the particular biodiversity projects that you're undergoing. At the moment, there's about 10 or 12 of the ASI members that are IBAT subscribers or have used IBAT. So we understand that it is very relevant, and having seen the new performance standard, that is continuing to be the case. But there are many more for which we believe there are opportunities. So in terms of trialing it, we can certainly set you up with free accounts on IBAT, so you can explore the platform, upload your projects, understand the look and the feel and the data sets. And then we can also demonstrate and provide samples of data and reports to you as well. So there's quite a few options there. And if any of that is interesting, then please do feel free to reach out.
Great, sounds good, Ben. Look, one last question, and it ties back into ASI and the requirements of the performance standard. And one of the questions that came through was about how does an ASI member use the outputs of STAR for the benefits of showing conformance to the ASI performance standard. And it got me thinking. I thought, well, maybe there's certainly requirements under Principle 8 around no net loss, data-driven rehabilitation reports, certainly ecosystem services and quantifying that and allocating metrics to that, development of targets for biodiversity action plans as well. So that was sort of some of the thoughts that crossed my mind. I was just wondering, and I'm not sure of how much you know regarding the performance standard requirements as such, Ben, but thinking, again, it's a question without notice, but thinking what sort of outputs could STAR provide with respect to the performance standard requirements? Am I on the right track there?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the criterion 8 is really where IBAT and STAR will come into play. I think all of those options that you mentioned before are the types of things that we want to be thinking about when companies are applying STAR in relation to the performance standard. We'll have to think carefully about exactly which of those STAR is best placed to speak to, and to ensure that it is fully meeting the requirements that you have. But one of the options with IBAT is always to develop bespoke reports for organizations. So we have the public facing reports, the proximity, the performance standard 6, the generic STAR report. But if there are versions of those reports that can speak to your specific requirements, then we'd be pleased to think about developing those. So let's carry on that conversation.
Yeah, great. Good to hear, because that's what we're after. We're after those tools that are going to help us in the implementation of the standard. So no, good to hear. Look, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, Ben, for your time. And just before we close up, this has been, I think, the 18th 45-minute on session already, and we've got another couple coming up in the next 4 weeks too. So actually a week from now, we've got one on grievance mechanisms. And that'll be tri-hosted, if that's such a phrase, by BSR, Coppermark and RMI. And on the 8th of November, we've got one which actually is a perfect segue from here. It's about biodiversity metrics for business by Hugo Rainey from the World Conservation Society. So continuing on the theme from what Ben's talked about today. So we see this as part one of a two-part series with Hugo doing the second part in about 3 weeks from now. So thank you all for your attendance and participation today. Wishing you well, and we'll speak again soon. Thanks again, Ben.
Thanks so much.